To talk more about how Python works, I thought we'd do a little project figuring out how long it's going to take to pay off a mortgage. Essentially, we're going to use Python as a calculator and talk about some of its basic statements for control flow and calculation. To start this off, what I'm doing is making a program called mortgage.py. And the very first thing that I thought I would talk about is just the execution of Python statements. Python really does come out of the world of scripting languages. And the way that it executes your program is it starts at the top of the program and goes line by line, executing each statement. The things that I'm typing here are comments. I'm writing a program, mortgage.py, find out how long to pay off a mortgage. A comment is something that starts with a pound sign, just goes to the end of the line. Okay, so that's what I'm going to start the program with. What I'm going to do next are define some variables. So if you want to store a value, what you do is you just assign a name to a value, like principal is equal to 500,000, or payment is equal to 2684.11, rate is 0.05. What you're doing is you're making variable declarations by doing this. A few things that are of interest if you come from another programming language, Python does not require you to declare data types. So if you're used to saying things like float payment, you don't do that in Python. Essentially, a variable is a name for a value. The type, if you want to think about it, comes from the value that's being assigned. The fact that this 2684 is a float makes payment a float. Another thing that I'll mention is just the rules for variables. Variable names in Python have to start with either a letter or an underscore, and then consist of letters, underscores, or digits after that. So for instance, I could put an underscore on the name of that variable, and that's fine. I could put digits into the variable name, and that's okay too. The main thing is that you can't start a variable name with a digit. Python follows really the same conventions that a lot of other programming languages follow. So I've defined some variables to get started here. Now what I'm going to do is start doing some calculations. And the way that this is going to work is I'm going to execute a while loop while the principal is greater than 0. While statement is one of Python's control flow structures. And what it's going to do is execute a block of statements as long as this condition is true. So as long as principal is greater than 0, it's going to execute statements. And in here, I'm going to do some math calculations. So let's figure out the interest on this thing. The interest will be the principal times the rate divided by 12. And then I'm going to update the principal by adding in the interest and then taking away whatever the payment is. And then I'll update a variable by adding in the payment here. Okay, so I'm using Python as a little calculator. As far as doing math calculations, there's not really any big surprises in Python. It follows the same rules that you would find from a math class, as far as what the operators are, the order of operation, and so forth. So you can certainly use those in a Python program, and it will work the way that you expect it to work. Another thing that you're seeing here just concerns the structure of this while statement itself. One thing that you might ask, what denotes the start and the end of this while loop? This is actually one of Python's more controversial features, but it's indentation. If you want to know what the while loop is executing, it's executing all of the statements that are indented under it. So all of those statements that you see indented there will execute in the loop. The way that you terminate the loop is you have a statement that's not indented. So for instance, this print statement at the end, that ends the while loop because it's not indented under the while loop. Few things about that indentation feature, by the way. The only thing that Python cares about is that you're consistent with your indentation. So the fact that it's indented 4 spaces, that doesn't really matter. I could indent 2 spaces if I wanted to, or I could indent 6 spaces. Again, Python won't be bothered by that as long as you're consistent with your indentation. If for some reason your code started to look ragged like that, then it's not going to work. You'll get an error when you try to run your program. Just so you know, there is a standard for indentation. Usually programs are indented by 4 spaces. So if you define a block, you go in 4 spaces, and you use spaces instead of tabs, by the way. Turns out if you use the tab character in a Python program, it just won't even run. You get a syntax error. So here's a simple program. Take a look at it, make sure that it looks reasonable here. Have some comments at the top, some variable definitions under that, and a while loop to carry out a calculation. If I run this, it should come up. We'll see if it runs here. Comes up and says I paid $966,000 using Python as a calculator. Now, to extend this program, let's focus on the amount paid there. I'm clearly in the wrong line of work, it seems. The fact that this mortgage is going to cost almost $1 million and it's only a $500,000 mortgage. One of the things that we maybe want to do is find out whether we could reduce the amount by having maybe an extra payment of some kind. Maybe I'm going to modify the program by having an extra payment of $1,000. And then maybe I'll apply this over some time period. What I'm doing here is maybe modifying the program to kind of play a scenario or something. Like if I were to pay an extra $1,000 for the first 60 months, would that reduce the amount of the mortgage or not? So what I'm doing here is introducing more variables into the program. And then maybe I'll modify this while loop to update those. So I'm going to increment the month. And then maybe I'll check to see whether the month is in this range, start and end month. To do that, I'm using another control flow feature of Python, which is the if statement. So this is how you do a conditional. You use if to check whether something is true or not. The body of the width is indented. Remember, you always indent when you want to denote a body of something. If I have that extra payment being applied, the total is going to be payment plus extra payment. And then if that's not true, maybe the total payment is just going to be payment. So we've modified the program, have a if and else statement in there. Again, if you've used another programming language, if and else in Python works exactly the same way it does in other programming languages. And then I'm going to modify the program to incorporate that total payment there. Okay, so instead of payment, we're going to update with total payment. So got a little modification to the code here. Let's go ahead and run that. See if it makes any difference at all in our calculation. So we run that. It tells us that we now have to pay $824,000. Just to kind of know whether that's a good deal or not, again, we could fire up Python as a calculator and maybe compute the difference. 966 minus 824. Okay, so it's $141,000. And then we paid in $60,000 with extra payments doing that. So it looks like we maybe saved about $80,000. Definitely a good deal on my part. So it's a little summary of what we've done here. This is the kind of code that you would typically write if you're just using Python for a lot of scripting tasks. There's not a whole lot to the language per se. I mean, you have comments, you have variables, you have while loops, you have if statements. You can kind of put that together and write larger programs doing that. So getting started is usually not a very hard thing in Python.